Hello and welcome to another episode of Fully Charged Plus podcast. I think we are actually changing the title and the branding. It might just be called Plus Podcast. We're doing it in stages. We'll get there eventually. But what is very exciting is I'm actually joined by a very, very special guest on this week's episode in the studio. And as you can see, the studio is in a bit of a mess because it's being refitted with infrared heaters, which is happening very soon. But that's not what we're talking about here today. Please welcome Imogen Pierce, who I first saw you in relation to with JLR and the Jaguar page, and you used to work at JLR, and you're proper bloody clever engineer, and you know stuff.
Oh, I don't know if that's actually true. I think
you do.
LinkedIn paints a good picture.
For me, anyway, in comparison with me, you know some really important stuff. So, which admittedly isn't a massive high bar; it's a fairly low bar. But so we're going to go through. So Imogen has written some brilliant stuff. She's working on Fully Charged now, Fully Charged show, doing some really exciting stuff. You've just been at one of the biggest wind turbines in the world. We'll talk about that in a minute. But we're going to talk about a blog that Imogen wrote that is on our website, fullycharged.show. Yeah, before we start though, we're just going to have a quick mention of our wonderful sponsor, My Energy, who make this podcast possible. And let's hear some lovely words about the My Energy, or the huge range of My Energy products that are really worth investigating. I've got one just the other side of that wall.
My Energy is putting the I back into British innovation. My Energy is putting the I back into inventing the future. My Energy is putting the I back into inspiring a nation. Recharging the world with green, smart energy. Charge your EV with your PV and more. Visit myenergy.com and help to spark the green revolution. My Energy, driving the charge to a greener future.
Okay, let's dive in now. Imogen, this article you wrote, which I really loved, it's such a genius idea. It's one of those things that as soon as you hear it, you go, so I've heard for many decades about universal basic income and the concept that, almost science fiction originally, the concept that machines will do everything that we want to do. So what do we do with human beings? Give them a universal basic income, kind of utopian, phantasmagorical notion, which is gaining traction every now and then. I don't know what I think about that, but universal basic mobility is actually a much better, easier to grasp idea.
Yeah, it's kind of like universal basic income's slightly less controversial cousin.
Yes.
So I guess for those not familiar with what universal basic income is, it's the concept that everyone gets a basic amount of income from a government, and that's that's income that they're not necessarily sort of exchanging labour for, and the rationale for that is, as you described, there's loads of robots, there's less work, there's this basic standard of living that people should have.
And the idea with that was always you could also work and earn more money than your basic income. It's not like you're locked into that. I think that was, but it means that you won't starve. That's basically
exactly
the idea.
And I think it also, and that's where you really can go down some kind of real science fiction, dystopian, Black Mirror kind of futures that, actually you can spend more time supporting your community and work that's not necessarily rewarded financially in other means. Yeah. But universal basic mobility seems like something that's possibly in a much nearer term future and is actually being trialled today. And essentially, it's the idea that all citizens get some kind of basic level of access to mobility.
Right.
So, for example, they're trialling a pilot in Oakland in California, and a select group of participants have $300 per month, which they can use on shared services or public transport.
Wow, I mean, it's actually quite a lot of money.
It is quite a lot of money.
It's not a token amount, is it? Wow.
And especially then when you put it in context. So the whole sort of rationale for this is that if you can pay for transportation, then you can get access to more jobs and hopefully to better paying jobs. and then at some point, that kind of access to those funds is no longer required by that particular individual. So it's a mechanism to try and address transportation equity.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is, I think what is becoming more apparent the more time I spend thinking about how we move around. So when it first started, it went, an electric car, that's brilliant. Well, I always knew it didn't solve every problem. I always knew it solved some problems, definitely, urban air pollution and energy and all those things. It solves a lot of problems, but it's there's still that basic thing. When you look at a city, when you go into a busy city and it's full of cars, it doesn't make sense. And it is that it's a completely different approach to, if you were to start from scratch and say, how should we move around? Oh, let's build a 2.5 ton steel box that takes one person into a crowded, dense urban area. You wouldn't do it.
Well, this is it. And I kind of think, when I sort of delved into this particular topic about universal basic mobility and its sort of, arguments for it and how it could change sort of the way that we move around cities, what you really quickly understand is that cities have evolved and grown and all sorts around the car, as you described.
Particularly the last 100 years, definitely.
Yeah, and then, and some of the grumbles around universal basic mobility is like, this is, paying money towards people and all this sort of, governs. But actually, when you look at how transportation is currently being subsidised by governments, vehicle use is being subsidised. Every kind of investment in sort of new highways and I saw an amazing quote where, I can't remember, I think it was the mayor of Oakland, I'm definitely going to get that wrong, somebody from Oakland was like, if residents could see, if you paid for parking, the land, hang on, let me explain that again. So if you paid for parking the amount that it would cost in rent, then you start to realise how much local governments are subsidising the use of your car.
Right, yes, yeah.
And so transportation, obviously there are loads of use cases where you absolutely need a car. But there's also loads where getting a bus and having better kind of shared services would be much better for, a much nicer urban environment to be in, really.
Yeah, it is those sort of hidden, well, it's in a sense like, the criticism that renewables get because they're subsidised by the government, and there's always that way of, and then you go, well, yeah, but fossil fuels are subsidised by the government to a vast extent through tax breaks and all sorts of deals that they've done with the big fossil fuel industry, which are trillions of dollars as opposed to a couple of million here and there. And that's, in a sense, that same thing as you built if a town council builds a multi-storey car park and invests that money in it, because it brings people into the city, it has benefits, but it's still a massive subsidy towards private vehicle ownership, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think if I could wave a magic wand and had these beautiful urban utopias, there'd be a more holistic way to think, okay, let's have our city. How do people live a better quality of life within this city, and how can we provide the mechanisms to make that possible? And an argument for universal basic mobility is, as sort of said, is that you can get access to jobs, you have more money, you can have a better quality of life. If you have more people with higher paid jobs, they're creating other additional businesses within an environment, there's more money within the sort of community, that sparks all this other thing. Has a fancy term called spatial agglomeration, which is it's a good word.
Spatial agglomeration. Wow, I'm trying to work it there. I can understand the spatial bit. I don't know what agglomeration is.
I think it is a fancy way of saying you get things clustering around hubs of activity.
Okay.
And that sparks more hubs of other activity. And so then if you're Mr. Local Government or Mr. National Government or Mrs. National Government, you're like, this city will see that return on this investment.
Right.
And it's a slightly different way of thinking about how you generate activity in an environment in a way that more people can access.
Yeah. Because that is the critical thing of, it's obviously going to be an ongoing and long discussion, but the way that automobiles exclude, it's the thing that we forget on Fully Charged all the time. And I just want to defend us a little bit by every other automotive journalist excludes them 100% without ever thinking about it. But it does exclude a whole group of people who haven't got cars, can't afford them, don't benefit from having motorways in between towns and car parks in cities and all that stuff. There's absolutely no advantage there at all. And that's even in the UK and European countries and North America, that's a lot of people. It excludes a hell of a lot of people, and it's very elitist and all those things. And this is nothing to do with electric cars. It's cars, basically. Private cars, I think, is the thing, isn't it?
And, I think things like lease schemes, and I'm sure people will sort of criticise them or have their particular views, but they do make a slightly lower barrier of entry to owning a vehicle. And that does equip people with so much freedom, and that whole sort of symbol of the car is freedom is true, but for some it's this big,
it's a huge
burden.
Financial burden.
And I think what's interesting is that it's not just a financial problem, because say you assess your options, you're like, financially I can't afford to own a car, it doesn't make sense. You're not just comparing that with the cost of a bus or the cost of cycling. It's actually, well, what do those distances mean in terms of time and frequency and access? And in the US this is a particular problem. Can you walk to those services? So there's just all these things that it's like, it's not just a cost problem, it's an access, it's a frequency, it's a supporting infrastructure problem. And I think, God, these are really basic problems that you think should be sorted. There should be pavements, for example.
Yes.
So that you at least have that option.
So you can walk. Yes. I mean, and also, one of the other things, and I remember, and I've got that book here somewhere, the Internal Combustion. It's one of those books up there. It is the story of the internal combustion engine, but what it really tells is how there actually were very good solutions for mobility in, say, 1908. When there were only 10 cars around. There were trams, there were bicycle lanes, there was a bicycle highway in Los Angeles, a raised wooden bicycle highway. Some of it still exists, man. I've never seen it. I've heard about it. So you could ride above the streets on a bike. It kept level. When it was going over small hills in Los Angeles, you would go flat along this thing. And that was it. That was built in like 1870 or something, when they were first settling in Los Angeles. It was a really, you rode a bike. Because it was California, you're not riding through through the slush of an English winter, and trams. The tram network in Los Angeles was built around trams, and it was crushed by the automotive industry and made to be built around cars. And the tyre industry. There's those little side things you never think of. But why did Goodyear want to get rid of the trams? So you bought a bus, and the tyres wore out, and you bought another tyre. Metal wheels on trams didn't wear out.
And that's just, I think, the interesting thing when you sort of start to look at the domino effect and what's the thing that arrives in a space that then dictates everything else around it. Had, for example, California continued to be a bike-friendly city, just think how differently the city would have evolved and how businesses, where they would be placed, how people sort of conduct their day-to-day lives, where their families are, their friends are. It's amazing. And it's a really obvious thing now I'm saying out loud, but how you move and how quickly it takes you to move completely determines how you live your life. And so it has to be very consciously planned, because how cities evolve happens very organically and chaotically around whatever that sort of bare bones system is.
Well, it's why, it is why old cities you go to in Europe are dense. Because you walked. The city of London is actually a very, very small area. You can walk from one side to the other in 20 minutes. It's not, but there might have been 700,000 people living there, all on top of each other, very cramped in. And whereas you go to Los Angeles, I remember driving across Los Angeles for sort of a day, and I was still in Greater Los Angeles. It's so huge and it's spread out over such an enormous area. It's just mind-boggling. And massive freeways, and all the time I was living there, I was just thinking, this is bonkers. In a way a crazy, unsustainable system. No matter what is going on. And at that time, I had fabulous sort of V8 muscle cars that I was loaned, and a Hummer, civilian Hummer. So that's what I I was, without question,
Yeah.
part of the problem, not part of the solution. But I knew this is crazy, and all Los Angelinos talk about is how crazy the traffic is, and then go and drive in it.
Yeah, and then think, God, I'm part of the problem, and this is the whole issue. But I think it's interesting because, something that's kind of regained popularity is this whole concept of a 15-minute city.
Ah, right, okay.
Yeah, and so the mayor of Paris is particularly keen on this idea, and basically the idea of a 15-minute city is that you should be able to access all the goods and services that you require to live your life within a 15-minute radius, but 15-minute radius by either bus, walking or cycling.
Right, wow. So that's hospital, school, shops, medical centre, everything, library, everything you could possibly need in a city would be a park.
Exactly,
It's all going to be within that, right.
And the big argument for it is that, okay, we need to consciously cultivate these communities and these neighbourhoods in a less car-dependent way. And of course, you things that exist out of the kind of normal parameters of daily life, yes, of course, you probably would still need your personal vehicle, but that's really cool. I think some people are quite skeptical about it because you can imagine that, say you've got your 15-minute city and you congregate with people who have very similar interests or who do similar jobs, and then you could create these bubbles of fractions, basically.
Or you could call them bubbles, which is the benign way. You could call them ghettos.
Or that, yeah.
Which is slightly worrying. Yes, no, absolutely. But in a sense, that does happen organically. London is the big city I'm most familiar with, in the fact there are areas where there's a lot of people from South Asia, or a lot of people from the West Indies, or a lot of people from Russia at the moment, from different, and it just does it. Not, northeast London, very intensely Jewish area with a lot of, what are they called? I was going to say fundamentalist Jews, but I don't want to offend anyone, but very...
Hasidic Jews.
Yes, Hasidic Jew, and you sort of go there and you go, oh my God, they've got hats and the ringlets, it's like it being in Jerusalem. And then you can go literally 500 metres down there and it's totally different. And it's Bangladeshi or something like that. But that does seem to happen.
Yeah.
That's not been enforced by a city authority, it's just happened.
No, and I think if you look at your friendship group, say for example you've got a particular interest in football, why could nothing else come to mind? Then you're probably statistically more likely to have friends who are also interested in football. So it's not a perfect system because you need to consciously create these 15-minute cities that accommodate different types of housing within that, so that you have, as diverse communities from a kind of racial perspective, an economic perspective, social perspective, all those sorts of things. So actually these communities are set up to thrive equally. So I don't know, I think universal basic mobility is almost like let's try this as a sort of version of the future, and keep one eye on things like 15-minute cities and see how we can recalibrate who we're prioritising and how we're prioritising them. So.
That whole area of debate around private car ownership, autonomous driving, which is kind of, I've heard some people speaking about this the other day about the flip side of Uber, how Uber, and it's about that in a sense, that desire that tech nerds have. They didn't start Uber to be evil and to crush people and to make life worse. They genuinely started it because they saw this is a better solution to get around in a city than we use now. And the taxi, particularly in the United States, I've used New York taxis. They're 1, terrifying, 2, unreliable, 3, you don't know if you're ever... The guy doesn't even know where he's going. They have no idea.
It tells you that he does, so it's
I might tell you what he does, But then, Uber was that. But then the flip side of that is they're absolutely brutal sort of, liberal capitalist juggernaut that just kind of crushes human beings, that don't fit in with it.
Well, so this is the...
And flood cities with cars as well. That was the flip. That was the kind of side. I remember when I first heard that, I was actually depressed. I went, oh, what a shame. Of course. And as soon as you think about it, of course, there's now 9,000 Priuses in that square mile where there was only 3 before.
And I think about situations when I've been on nights out and I'm like, oh, I should get the bus. But I'm like, but it's cold. Yeah. I will get an Uber.
And it'll take you right to your door.
But I think Uber and other kind of shared services are really interesting and how they kind of contribute to these sorts of topics, because there's a very interesting term, another one, called platform urbanism. And that is the concept that if you have an on-demand service, for example, Uber, those vehicles flock to the areas of demand.
Right.
And so they sort of cluster around high areas of demand. So let's say you've got a particularly affluent area, you probably will have more Ubers there than you will in other areas that are maybe slightly poorer. And so then you're creating this mismatch in availability of transportation. You then get the secondary effect that if suddenly, let's say, loads of people are using Ubers and the bus services are not being used as much, then there's less funding for the buses, or there's less incentive to sustain those particular bus routes. And so then people, again, from sort of poorer communities get the double whammy effect. So
they don't have Uber or a bus.
Yeah. And you're like, oh, great, thanks very much, Uber. But then there's people like, there's a really cool company called Via, and I don't know how they're sort of doing this, because Uber exists because obviously you're going to go to the area of high demand, and that's what drives your profits. And Via operates kind of like an Uber, but to plug gaps in public transit.
Right.
So it's sort of like not an Uber, not public transit. It's sort of this happy middle ground.
Right.
I don't know how they do it, but I just feel like they're very good people for doing it.
Right, and then does that exist now? And that's a functioning system. I've not heard of it. Right.
Yeah, so they're mainly in the US, but they do have. I think they've taken over a lot of the buses within Milton Keynes. So actually, that sort of runs as this like on-demand public transit.
Oh, so what can you sort of hail a bus as opposed to a car? Oh, right,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
Which does kind of it makes a lot more sense, doesn't it, to do that in a way than getting in the back of a Prius, which I know I have done. I mean, what I think that we're seeing, and I can't sense this happening on a kind of global political level, or it's not being discussed by politicians, but I feel there's an undercurrent and a certain an emerging movement of people who are questioning private car ownership. So if I go back to my youth when I was a hippie, and I was anti-car because I just thought they were bourgeois, and I'm embarrassed to say this, and I thought they were kind of, only fascists have cars, and I rode a bike and got caught the bus, but actually I was always kind of into cars and I liked them, so I was very, very conflicted. But I kind of knew then they were kind of smelly, stupid things and I couldn't afford one, and they were really expensive. And I had no political solution to that problem at all. And I grew up in the 1970s oil crisis, when there were 5-hour-long queues to go and buy 1 gallon of petrol in the UK because it was rationed, because there was no fuel. There were blackouts and the lights went out. It was quite a difficult period. I loved it because I was 16, 17 and it was exciting. Didn't really affect me. But there now seems to be emerging, and this is very much part of it, a really well thought out, plausible argument, which isn't like necessarily anti-car, but it's actually saying, look, there's probably going to be a much better way of doing this. I mean, that's what's emerging, and it goes back to that fundamental thing where, the absolute opposite of Top Gear. I want this car because it says something about me, all that nonsense.
Yeah.
This is well, how do you actually get from where you are now to where you want to go?
And that's it. And I think, with mobility as a service and different forms of mobility all connecting together, people are able to look at this as like, what is literally the most efficient way for me to get from A to B, or A to B via C, etc. And often that isn't the car. But equally, there are sort of situations. So I live in a reasonably remote village / town, and not having a car is really tricky unless you just want to stay within a 2-mile radius.
Yeah, because you wouldn't, if you didn't have a car and you couldn't get in one, or you couldn't travel outside the town, you could actually survive in that town. You could get everything, your doctor, food, you can eat, you can, the basics are there.
Yeah.
But it's very restricted.
Yeah. And
there's not a cinema. Or is there?
Might be getting
you might be getting a cinema.
And it has been like the talk.
Because there is a theatre.
There is a theatre, yeah. And the little sign went up saying cinema coming soon.
Wow.
And, yeah.
That would be very exciting.
I mean, I expect it'll have about 4 seats. It might just be
Someone's front room. It's just someone's bought a big telly.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
so my dad, he's retiring in soon, April this year.
Yeah.
And he's incredibly smug because he has driven to work. He would not be proud of that.
All right.
He has cycled to work every single day.
Oh, I see. Oh, right. He hasn't driven to work. He's cycled to work.
He hasn't driven to
Right.
work at all. And, you know, he's just like, I've managed to cycle to work. Other people could do it. And I think, well, no, they can't actually.
Yeah.
Not unless you live in sort of big towns, and that's sort of where.
Because do you know how far his commute is?
It's 12-minute cycle.
Right, so it's not a hell of a long way.
No.
And is it flat? Or is there any hills?
There is one hill.
There's one hill.
Yeah.
Well, I'm still impressed. I mean, if he's done that, he's always done that. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Well, he's going to be cross retelling the story actually. But I had appendicitis once, and he said, "I think you've got appendicitis, but parking at the hospital is really terrible, so we're going to have to cycle."
So you cycled with appendicitis?
Yeah, and including this one big hill. And I remember thinking, like, this is the worst day of my life. But
he's a hard man.
he's a keen cyclist. Yeah, when I went to work for Jaguar Land Rover, he was.
Oh yeah, because normally you'd think that a parent would be absolutely thrilled that you got this very prestigious job in engineering for Jaguar Land Rover. That everyone's heard of. If you're a keen cyclist, that's you've gone over to the other side, the dark side.
Exactly, and I just remember because we used to say, "Oh, I'll give you a lift to school," and it wasn't. It was back on the back of his bike, but we'd cycle past this Range Rover garage. I just, from a really young age, I just thought they were the coolest thing. And I felt like it was the secret that I couldn't admit.
But did your family not have? You didn't own a car.
We did have a car, but I grew up in Southampton. It is very doable to cycle most places.
Yeah.
So, yeah, quite unique in that regard.
Yeah.
But no, certainly where we are now, you do need a car to be able to get, particularly to the jobs that you want to do.
Yes, that would be that if you were stuck there, your employment prospects are extraordinarily limited.
Like work in the cinema now.
You can work in the cinema,
That's exciting.
or you can work in the bakery, or the lovely bookshop. You've got a lovely bookshop.
Oh, it's such a nice bookshop. Yeah,
that is a very nice bookshop.
Yeah.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. It is difficult, and I mean, where I live here, we couldn't. Well, the thing is, it's so ridiculous because I say we couldn't live here without a car. People did live here for maybe 5,000 years without cars, but they did tend to marry their sisters and brothers. And that's the only downside of it, I think. But
But I think it is interesting that as much as we invest in public transport and in better provision of cycle lanes, etc., that there is still a need for cars.
Yeah.
And I know that so many people look at this looming deadline of 2030 as this terrifying thing of, how the hell are we going to afford this, and how the hell is my house where I don't have a driveway going to be able to support this way of living. And I think having those conversations and sort of looking at the network holistically of like, okay, well, this is the amount of driving you do, this is the amount you could be supported on public transit, and looking at a balance and a much more kind of shared use mobility or mobility as a service model is a way, I think, to give consumers a lot more assurance that this is a viable.
Yeah. Well, it was what we saw in Utrecht, I think, was really interesting, and it's really difficult to judge because what the one thing we didn't really discover was what it would cost. So, if you joined the car sharing, We Drive Solar is the car company that does them, and they've got a lot of cars and a lot of variety of cars, but I don't actually know what it costs, say, to have a Renault Zoe for 5 hours. And it may be prohibitively expensive, and a poorer family that wanted to use it to go to the shops can't afford it. I don't think that is the case. I think if you hire the Tesla Model X, that's probably quite expensive. But what we did discover was, I would classify them as normal people. So not very, very rich and not very, very poor, have sold their private cars because using the car sharing is better. And that's what they all said. They weren't saying, well, we've decided to make this massive compromise and really do without and really tighten our belts and have a more miserable, more restricted life, but we feel good about it. No, they do anything that they could do before with a car, except they don't have to own it and worry about it. You know?
Yeah.
And and that was their whole aim, was that it's a better experience, and it's communicating that to people who've grown up with private car ownership as an absolute kind of core thing of their lives. To go, well, actually, you know, just for a moment, stop arguing about what it looks like, what colour it is, how fast it goes, all those things. If it was better overall for you to have that, and you still had the access to a car when you needed it, you know, what is the disadvantage of that? And that was their argument, is it's got to be better than the hassle. And that's an old city, an old European city, where parking a car is a nightmare, unless you've got one of their ones which has got its own dedicated parking space and a charging post.
Well, that's it. I think it's not just about the mode and sort of how you access it. It's like, is it a seamless experience?
Yes, it's got to be seamless. Yeah.
And can it get you to a point where you're not even thinking, oh God, I'm going to like this.
I've got to book a car next week because I need to do that.
Yeah. It's going to be this big faff and I'm having to plan ahead.
Yeah.
It needs to be, you don't even need to think about it.
Yeah.
And at that point, then it's a complete no-brainer.
And I think one of the other ones, and she's going to come on the podcast soon, is the woman I met in Oxford. I won't talk about her too much now because we're going to she'll explain what they do. But that is a community-based car sharing system, very, very local. So like 4 city blocks, if you like. It's very close. So most of the people will, if they don't know each other, they'll know where the person lives.
Yeah.
And so it's privately owned cars, but the people who own the cars, there's an app. The people who own the cars go, well, look, we're not going to Little on Tuesday, so we'll open it's like Airbnb, and you'll open the car up and other people can use it, and you get a nominal amount of money. So the costs are covered; it doesn't cost you anything, and the fuel cost and everything. But someone else uses your car. And what has been interesting, so the woman I spoke to has got 2 small children. One of the hassles that we heard about in Berlin in the big car sharing thing there, was you can get the car and it'd be outside your house. It's not far, there's so many of them, but then you've got to put a car seat in the back and then take it out when you finish all that. And this thing, there's a woman up the road who's got a big SUV with 3 car seats in anyway, because she's got small kids. So you want to use it with your kids, there's a car. You know, and that you think, well, that's fantastic, because you're also not buying new cars and putting them in special parking spaces and adding more stuff to the city. You're using what's already there, but using it more.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, I'm sure someone has done this, it must exist, but when you first described this to me, I was like, oh, people should do that with like tools, like lawnmowers and stuff. So that was a TV show that I wanted to make that never came off, which was, it was because I heard of a fire station in northwest London that was going to be redeveloped and it was empty. And I've never even went to see it, but I heard about it, and it has something like 12 bedrooms. It's quite a big building. Yeah. It's got the big spaces at the bottom to put the fire engines in. It wasn't being used. There was a new fire station up the road. And the idea was for a school term, you get people who live in that area. So this is like a reality TV, but you're not putting them on an island in the Hebrides where it's all different. They live in the same area, so they live literally around the corner. They'd all move into this place together. There would be one kitchen, there'd be one big washing machine, one big tumble dryer, one mode of transport, a minibus. Yeah.
And then and they would go to school as they normally did. They go to their work that they normally did. There would be nothing in their lives would change except where they live. And it was 4 families.
Yeah.
5 families. That was it. And that was one of the bits of grit, because I said to Judy, my wife, "Darl, we just live there for like a term because they want me to be in it." and she said, "I thought the whole point was it was where you went to school. So our kids would have to go to a different school. She'd have to work in a different place." So we didn't do it. Anyway, it never came up. But the research we did into that was a phenomenal drop in energy use, a phenomenal drop in traffic, in water usage, and like there would be one big fridge, not like 6 little ones.
Yeah.
And one big washing machine that did your laundry, but you'd all have to live together with lots of other families. So the idea was all families with kids that would live there.
That's really interesting, because the economies of scale of
it makes a huge
it's
difference.
Not times 6, it's not times 5.
No,
it's times 1.5.
Yeah,
probably.
and so we did do things like they did mock-ups of, we would gather all the garbage and show this is how much you throw away when it's 6 families and 6 houses, and this is how much you throw away here, and everything was hugely reduced. But then that is suggesting that people living in communes, which is, it's been tried.
Yeah, I mean, this could have been the making of like a horror film as well.
It could have been, yeah. Multiple murders in the old fire station after 3 days and people go mad. Yeah, that could be quite difficult.
The critical thing, and when you described the car sharing in Oxford, I was thinking about, actually I feel like you can tell a lot about someone's personality from how clean inside their car is. And people's perception of how clean they are. And I was thinking specifically about my sisters, and I was like, I share a car with my sister Olivia. I wouldn't share one with the other one. But, you know.
What, your other sibling?
Yeah, they just...
But what I love is you've named one sibling who drives a tidy car. You haven't named the other sibling.
I only have 2 sisters as well, so process of elimination.
I think they may work out which one you mean.
Yeah.
But I can see that. And I mean, I think people would have difficulty sharing my wife's car, because that tends to be... It's actually quite clean at the moment because she's away, and I've cleaned it up because there was some unpleasant stuff. I wanted to use tongs to clean it up.
Oh, God.
There was and I think it's people who've lived in big countries tend to do that, because you might drive all day.
Yeah.
You know, in Australia where she grew up, you know, you drive down to Sydney. It takes 2 days. You know, so you've got to, you know, you just chuck everything in the footwell. You know, and tissues and bottles and, oh God, everything in there.
But then I guess that is how things change when, you know, you've got, say for example, shared vehicles, or you're using mobility assets differently.
Yeah.
It is for an overall good for a community.
Yeah.
And because it's not sort of just your sole use, I wonder if that does change how you kind of perceive it as a kind of public good and kind of respect it in a different way. But maybe that's like a very kind of altruistic view.
Yes, it might be, but actually from what I've heard from both the car sharing in the Netherlands and in Germany, because that was the first time I saw it on a big scale. Car to go in Berlin was like thousands of cars. It wasn't like 3 in one block, and they were all over the city. I think Germans are tidier than British people. Because the British cameraman I was with there was saying, God, you imagine if this was in London, these would all be trashed and full of beer cans and crisp packets. But actually, you know who's been in the car.
Yeah.
That's, you know, once you understand that, so you use the app and you can get in the car. And you actually, in Germany, you use your driving license. You put it on a little scanner on the windscreen. That opens the car, and there's the key, and you can drive it. You know, so they know who you are when you drive it. So if you trash it,
God, Dave is a right pain.
Yes, you'll know who it was, and you know every time. And also, there were big incentives to fuel the car. So a lot of those were petrol cars. They weren't. We did use some electric ones, but this was a few years ago. And if it's nearly empty and you go to a filling station, fill it up, you don't have to pay for it. Your card covers the cost of filling it. So you're not paying money to fill the car up, but you get extra minutes of rental time free because you've fueled it. And so we wanted to do that. We wanted to film that, like plug in the electric one. All of them we got in were full. We never got in a car with any. We couldn't cram any more electrons or petrol in any of them. They were all fully fueled up.
But then I was thinking about this, because if you incentivize good behaviour rather than penalise bad behaviour, you always incentivising good behaviour. That's what sticks in terms of sort of like community behaviours. And I was thinking about this. The way I'm going to say this is like I'm comparing people to dogs. But with my dog, for example, she does something good. She gets rewarded for it. She understands that's good. You can't have a rational conversation about something she did yesterday that was not so good. And I think people are quite basic, do good things, get rewarded for it. Whereas, I probably shouldn't admit this, but there is a station near where I live, and I worked out the frequency of when the ticket man came. And so
this is a train station.
Yeah, train station. Sorry, train station. And I would park my car there. And I worked out the frequency of when the ticket man would come to get your ticket.
Oh, right, okay, as in the parking ticket man.
Yeah, I should.
Sorry, yes, I thought it was a train ticket man. No, so you park your car and you're meant to you're meant to pay for the parking.
So parking ticket. At the station, train station.
But you know when the inspector comes round to see who's paid.
Yeah, and so it worked out more cost effective. This is so terrible because there's now 2 big potholes in this particular car park, and I'm like, that's because people like me haven't been.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah.
And I worked out that it was more cost effective for me to get the fine than it was to
Pay every day you used it.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I was like, that's really backwards. That I am not disincentivized by the kind of sanctions for not doing things in a particular way. And I've also gamed the system, which is bad and not recommended.
Yeah.
But things like getting more minutes for having filled the car.
Yeah.
That's great.
It's positive.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, like I was saying to you earlier, I've got to drive quite a long way, or got to travel a long way to go and see something up in the north of England, and looked at the trains, which I would much prefer to get, to be honest, on that sort of journey, because I don't read a book and do that. And it's just prohibitively difficult and takes much longer and is much more expensive than driving. I mean, admittedly, I'm driving an electric car to do it, so it is cheaper anyway, but...
Even then it would still work out.
Oh, God. I mean, I could go reverse in a Range Rover. A Range Rover Sport backwards, and it would be cheaper than... It's just incredibly... And it's an unfortunate, difficult journey, because I've got to change twice, and it makes it so it's quite a clunky journey anyway, which is why it takes longer. But you just think, that is just wrong that that's the case. And actually, if I was in London and went there, it would make sense to go on the train, because it goes direct there from London. So that's down to kind of the rail network. But probably 80, 70 years ago, in fact, when I was born, before the beaching report came out where they closed lots of trains, I probably could have done it much easier. In the olden days, it would have been easy to do it on a train. There would have been more routes to take you there.
Well, that's it. And I hope that, a good thing about mobility data that you get from vehicles or from how people use Uber or whatever, is that you've got this enormous pool of oh right, this is how people move, this is where they need to go when.
Yeah.
Here are systems that we can put in place to make them work. But I know that this is another fancy word, that's a very techno-solutionist way of looking at it.
Yes, I know, and I think I've been guilty of being a bit techno-solutionist in the last few years. I'm trying to shrug it off.
I feel like it's always my go-to things. I'm like, this is a challenge. Here's how we solve it, and in a very kind of logical way. But it's not how society.
But then it is interesting. I think your journey. Let's just quickly cover that, because that's how I came across you. So that. You worked at JLR, well, you can't get more of a sort of private ownership car manufacturing, your Range Rover or your Jaguar is a status symbol and says something about you. That's where you started. But then you worked at Arrival for, I don't know how long you were at Arrival.
3 years.
3 years, right.
Yeah.
Which effectively is the opposite. It's making electric vehicles that aren't private ownership vehicles. They're either delivery vans, buses, taxis. That's what they're working on.
Yeah, and I remember when I moved to...
I mean, was that a conscious thought on your part? I mean, obviously Arrival are a very exciting company and they're kind of in a different startup, different ball game. But I mean, was that part of the decision was around that?
So I know, so at the point I left Jaguar Land Rover, they were, so it was just after the I-Pace launch.
Yeah.
And we were obviously starting to talk more about electrification, but I felt that I would like to be in a place that was solely focused on electrification.
Right. So that was the electrification was the bigger.
But the big kind of heartache about it, I was like, but there's really nice, fun things like amazing, beautiful car launches, and every film you see it has a Jaguar or Land Rover in it, and it's a cool brand to be a part of.
Yeah.
And I was like, do I find buses cool? Do I find vans cool? And what I have discovered is that it has turned me into a complete mobility nerd, because I think you're not just talking about buses and vans, you're talking about how people live their lives and how those lives could be dramatically impacted by their access to transport. And I was reading last week that there's a lot of heartache because they're cutting some of the bus routes in Wakefield.
Right.
And people are concerned about how they're going to get to hospital appointments, how they're going to get to work. And so then when you look at the solution you were trying to create as a business through that lens, and in the case of vans, you're thinking this isn't just a van, this is someone's place of work.
Yeah.
It completely changes how you think about it. And then when you throw in the other stuff that Arrival are trying to do, like make it price comparative with the petrol diesel equivalent, make it sort of very accessible. It was cool to be part of that journey, but I did have that real but Range Rover.
Yeah.
Range Rover is so nice.
Yeah, no, I mean, they are extraordinary vehicles. I mean, I can't love them anymore. I was always impressed with them, and when the Range Rover first came out, I just thought that was so cool, and I'd never even met anyone who had one. I didn't know, I just saw them, and they were so distant from my world. But but when I've been in them, I drove one around Los Angeles, where it kind of made more sense because it doesn't feel like a big car in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
It's a small hatchback, but it was so lovely, and they're so comfortable and they're so capable. The interiors are ridiculous. No, I mean, they're amazing.
It was just, I mean, I feel so lucky to have had that opportunity to work.
How long were you there at JLR then? You were there quite a few years, weren't you?
Four years, I think.
And also the I-Pace was and is an extraordinary machine. I mean, regardless of anything else, it's an incredible piece of engineering. It really is.
And it was the first time I understood what cab forward meant as well, because you are slightly more.
Oh yes,
forward. Obviously haven't got an engine in the front of the car. That is a really remarkable car, and I think, and I'm sure this is felt whichever sort of automotive company engineers work for, but you're working on something and then you see it in the real world, and you see people talk about it. And there was this one air duct that I worked on when I was 19 as an intern, and even now I look at the XC and I'm like,
that's my air duct.
That's my air duct. Well, it probably isn't even my air duct anymore, but I did work on it and worked on that air curtain, and that's cool to have that kind of tangible sense of what you're doing and how it impacts the world, how people see it. Just be nice if they get on with their electrification.
Yes, which we hope they will. Yes, I really do. I think they probably will. We ought to go and have our tea.
Yeah.
We haven't had our tea. But Imogen, you've got to come. We've got to do more because I've got a whole list of topics that it was good that we didn't talk about. Because I mean, I just want to say as we wrap up that to read the blog that you wrote is really interesting. It's on fullycharged.show under the title "Is Universal Basic Mobility the Route to a Sustainable City?" It's really interesting because we kind of basically brushed over the top of it because it's very detailed.
Which luckily, to be honest, because I reread it this afternoon and there's a lot of stuff I was like, I forgot I knew that.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah, no, it's definitely worth a read. And that's it. Let's wind it up. So, please do, the normal stuff, I don't even want to say it, but I'm going to anyway because I'll get told off if I don't. But do subscribe. Do check out the fullycharged.show page about the live shows, which are very, very exciting. I've had a bit of an update this morning about the live shows. It's bonkers. And what's happening in Amsterdam. So the one in England is at the end of April and the first day of May. The one in Amsterdam is in the middle of
20th of May.
20th, 21st, around that time of May in Amsterdam. Some really exciting stuff that we know is going to be there. Some quite terrifyingly exciting stuff going to be at Farnborough. And then later in the year, we're in San Diego, which is, again, cringy. So there are some good, so have a look at that. All the information about all those things and all the blogs and on all the episodes we've ever done are all on the fullycharged.show page. Do subscribe to your podcast app for this because there's lots of exciting stuff coming on this. And we've just heard today that a lot of people listen and mainly listen to this podcast, which is good. It's good to know that we're not just waffling into the void. And that's it. I'm going to shut up. As always, if you have been, thank you for watching.